Great. Welcome everyone to Mass Energized Communities meeting. And if you have a minute, if you could put in your name, rename yourself to include your town name, that's always helpful for everyone in the audience to figure out who's here. I'm Amy. I am with Mass Energize and I live in Framingham. So we have a Framingham site. We have just a few super short announcements, and then we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Greg Sparkmann. So Kat, go ahead with announcements from Mass Energize.
Yes, hi everybody. Just quickly to announce that we have a new Mass Energize website. And I will do a very quick screen share of that. And feel free to come in and visit. So it's just massenergize.org. And you will be happy to know that all the communities, I'm a little delayed here. You should all be here now, and we invite you to give us any feedback if you want to change anything, change a logo, etc. But I think we caught you all. So that is one. And then I'll stop sharing. Then we are also working, and this is really Brad's thing, but he can't be here, so that's why I'm mentioning it. But he's the one who worked most on this. We are in the midst of doing some really serious updates to the software. Hopefully they'll be done by the end of next week. And just to give you a little flavor of those, a ton of work has gone into an upgrade of our code base, which will make all of our platforms, all of our sites more searchable by search engines. So that was a very necessary thing, and here it is. Actually, next week there will be. And we fixed also a couple of bugs. We do know that the images on the action cards are smaller than they should be. We fixed that bug, so that will be fixed next week. And we also fixed some counting issues with the counters. And then there's some really nice enhancements that we've been promising. One is the disabling of pages that you don't want to use. For instance, you don't want to have a donate page. You can turn that off and it will even disappear from the bar up top. And we will also have a way for community admins to sign people up in one go through a spreadsheet. So that might come in handy in some of your cases. So we're still fixing this and testing. Every time we fix something, we change something, we have to test it. We're doing that. ETA is next week, and after that we will look more closely at some of our graphics, and we will look into how to do nudges, and that will then be the next version. So we'll take a little breather after this one. And then we'll start looking at some other fun enhancements. That's it for me.
I would just add to what Kat said. I think Brad is happy to do a meetup to just walk people through some of the changes, and we'll send you an email about that.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Kat. Now, everyone, this next part is really important. I'm going to tell you about the rest of the meeting, but as we start out, if you have questions as we're going along, please put them into the chat. We'll be collecting those and using them and helping to facilitate the Q&A. So as we're going along, that will be really helpful for everyone. Okay, so Ellen's going to introduce Dr. Sparkmann. He's going to tell us about his research. We're going to go into some groups and do some talking. He's going to tell us some more. We're going to go into question and answer, and then we're going to really try to stump him. And this is all going to be a really exciting discussion, and I'm absolutely thrilled. So I'll turn it over to Ellen for the introductions.
Yeah, so I'm going to introduce Greg and not call him Dr. Sparkmann, if he's okay with Greg, which I think he is. So Amy and I heard Greg on a talk, and we both didn't realize we were listening to Greg, and we just slacked each other and said, this guy Greg Sparkman's pretty good. He's saying some stuff that's really useful, and we should learn from him. And what Greg's research, he got his PhD at Stanford. He's moved on to Princeton as a postdoc, and I just pulled it from one of his bios. He's really looking at how we can motivate people to adopt sustainable behavior or attitudes when they are currently not the norm or going against the status quo. And it's been about a bunch of social movements and environmental movements. So when Amy and I spoke to Greg, we said, as someone who does research in my professional life, we're always interested in people using our research and turning it into action, right, Greg? We don't want to just write papers, although it's very good for the academic world, but we really want people to use the research. And so we invited Greg because we thought his research was so applicable to all the outreach work you guys are doing. So I want you to be thinking about what Greg is saying and thinking about how we can apply it locally, and we'll have breakout rooms and we'll have an exercise to do that. And if we want, this will not be our only interaction with Greg Sparkmann. We've convinced Greg to at least honor us with the possibility that we could turn some of these ideas into some more playbooks or toolkits or something, and we'll want your thoughts about it. So with no further ado and a lot of great intro, I'm going to hand it over to Greg. And Greg, you're going to talk for a while, and then you'll put us into an exercise, then we'll come back to talking, and Amy's laid that all out. So there'll be plenty of opportunity.
Great. So yeah, this is being recorded. I'm happy to share slides too and things like that. And I do have like a little synopsis of all my research on my website. So anyone who wasn't able to make it, there'll be ways probably to cover all this stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and share screens and move over to some slides. But don't be afraid, there will be some interaction. Okay. So yeah, today I'm going to share some research of mine and some colleagues on psychology of climate advocacy, and particularly looking at different research on communication strategies. So as a kind of general roadmap for what we're going to talk about for kind of this upcoming hour, we're going to look a bit at social influence, in specific something that I'm going to refer to as dynamic norms. There'll be a bit of an activity surrounding that idea for a while. And then we'll come back and I'll kind of rapid fire sort of cover 3 other topic areas that I think will be of interest to you all. One is on advocacy and how to think about that in the context of walking the walk, which might come up in climate or sustainability related domains. Another one is how to think about climate concern and something called psychological distance, things that we perceive in the here and now or in the future and far away. And then I'll talk a little bit about the challenges of acting consistently for climate change and how messaging can kind of help us ensure that people don't just take action once, but manage to continually do so over the course of many domains in the course of their lives, hopefully. So let's jump right in. So first, I just want to give you a sort of super brief background in this crash course on social norms. So the idea here, in a nutshell, from a psychological standpoint, is you look around and you see everyone behaving the same way, or that everyone holds the same belief about something, and you think, oh, well, maybe that's the competent thing to do, or maybe that's important, or maybe that's enjoyable, or maybe it's socially approved of. It must be the norm for some reason. So essentially, when we see most people behaving the same way, or we think everyone holds the same opinion about something, we undergo this process of self-persuasion in order to explain why it's the norm, and that leads us to be more likely then to do the same thing that they do, or hold the same beliefs that they hold. So in this way, social norms regularly shape our sort of core beliefs about what might be true or good or socially reputable in the world. And social norms have been used a lot in the context of interventions to promote sustainable behavior or sustainable policy attitudes, including getting people to weatherize homes, to engage in composting, to conserve energy and water at home, to choose more sustainable transit options, and to vote or vote differently. However, there's kind of a tricky aspect to using norms, which is that in a lot of cases, the things that people are probably advocating for are things that aren't the norm right now. You're probably, you're probably going to be asking people to do things that aren't done by a lot of people, or perhaps promote policies that aren't yet in place. So these things are by definition going against the status quo. So how could you use social influence when you're trying to promote something that's counter-normative? Like, how does that work? And this might come up for adopting new technologies, supporting new policies, trying to shift behaviors and habits, like demand flexibility programs, for instance. So how do you motivate actions that go against the norm? Which in a lot of advocacy contexts is probably what you're trying to do. So that's where some of our research has looked at the idea of dynamic norms. And the idea here is that dynamic norms contain information, not just about what's the norm right now, but about changes in others' behavior and beliefs over time. So for example, some of my research has looked at when you tell people that more and more people are starting to eat less meat, that might motivate them to change their diets. Or if people learn that a growing number of Americans are becoming angry about climate inaction, that can increase their own personal support for climate policy. So in both of these cases, the emphasis isn't put on the fact that some people do it right now. It's put instead on the direction of change over time. Like, where is that norm going? And in doing so, it's able to promote things that aren't currently the norm in a lot of ways. So how exactly does this work? Well, dynamic norms might help, it seems, because they're able to resolve a variety of really common psychological barriers that make change hard. So sometimes we don't change because most people don't do that behavior or don't think that way. As I just mentioned, social norms are a large influence on people. But another kind of obstacle psychologically is that people might just doubt change is possible. Like, you're like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if that thing could ever pass. I don't know, fill in the blank, right? There's doubt that we could reach the ends. Even if I find them highly desirable, I might not take action unless I think it's really possible. We might also just doubt that something's not important enough to be worth changing for. So change inherently represents a bit of a hurdle in terms of some kind of psychological momentum, because we have to abandon things we're familiar with, we have to try things that we aren't that used to, and overcome habit. So for these reasons, there's naturally a hurdle getting people to do something they don't currently do. And in other contexts yet, it might not be any of the above problems. It might be something more related to one's identity. We might think that kind of change is not for people like me. People like me don't do that. And people have these kind of valued identities, and they want to approach behaviors that feel consistent with those valued identities. And they want to avoid behaviors that feel inconsistent with those valued identities. So when you tell people that more and more people are changing, or this is the direction things are going, or people are shifting in their behaviors or beliefs over time, it manages to kind of help overcome this variety of obstacles I just told you about that are pretty common. So one way they do that, in the context where people go, I'm not going to do this, I don't, like, no one does this. If you learn that more people are changing, you might think, oh, well, in the future, maybe that new behavior would actually be the norm. Maybe that's the direction things are going. So it overcomes this idea that the reason I'm not doing it is because it's not popular, because you might think, oh, in the future, maybe it actually will be the norm. In contexts where people doubt change is possible, it can be helpful to learn that others are changing, because if others can change, maybe I can too. People essentially make this inference from others' ability to change to their own ability to change. And we, by the way, on the side here, these are some of the terms associated with these things. So it shifts future norm perceptions when you learn that people are changing. It shifts what's called self-efficacy beliefs. This belief that, can I do things? Am I able to do that thing? In other contexts where we doubt change is not important enough, and we learn that many people are changing, we might think, oh, if others are changing, they might actually regard this as being pretty important. It turns out a lot of people have a lay theory that if someone changes, they thought something was worth changing for, right? And change is not seen as easy. So they think, oh, I bet that person kind of cares about that if they're willing to change for it. So even if you might doubt something's important, you can kind of convey, well, other people seem to think it's important, and that's why they're changing. So it can kind of help shift perceptions of current norms. And then lastly, if you think people like me just don't do this for some kind of behavior, and then you learn that many people are changing, it normalizes the idea that people like you who never did this before are starting to. So it actually doesn't seem so unusual for someone who's never done this to begin to, because you're kind of given many, many models of how many people transitioned in the way that you might as well. So it can help improve this kind of identity compatibility when you learn that people like you who didn't do this before are starting to. So let's kind of give some examples of how this might look. So for instance, let's say you were trying to persuade someone to consider buying an EV, and they say, I don't know, is it really worth the extra cost that it takes for an EV? And you might be able to identify, okay, so it really seems like they aren't sure this is important enough for like the cost, right? And you might say, well, more and more people are feeling that it is worth that upfront cost. And then you could kind of supplement that with information. It's like, it's really taking off. It seems like a lot of people are thinking this is actually a good investment. It is worth the cost, right? So you essentially provide information about others and how they're changing as a form of social proof that whatever they're concerned about isn't really a big deal. This is an example of kind of tailoring that statement to that doubt someone has. Here's another example. Someone might say, states like mine don't go for net zero. We don't really do that here. And you could say, a lot of states, including Louisiana and the Carolinas, are actually heading in that direction, right? So you could provide information about how things are changing and try to give examples that kind of match that identity of concern to portray it as people like you are starting to make that transition. So in each case, you're using information about how people are changing to try to kind of overcome whatever that barrier was that they seem to suggest in their sort of refutation, like why they don't want to do it. And so now, hopefully that wasn't Okay, so now we're going to do a quick activity for maybe up to 10 minutes. And the idea here is, first, I'm going to give you a series of contexts. And I first want you to try to diagnose what kind of doubt you think that person has based off of the little quote I'm going to give you in a second. And then I want you to try to actually draft a dynamic norm to convey the contrary to that doubt, right? So you're going to kind of practice making statements about how others are changing in order to thwart very specific barriers people highlight when they tell you, I'm not sure or no. So here are the ones that I have in mind. There's 4 of them. And they're going to you're going to bring in a variety of doubts here. So I want you to like read one of these, kind of make a guess as to which kind of doubt you think it is the person has. And then, okay, well, how would you convey that others are changing in a way that's going to kind of help thwart that doubt that person has? So we'll take 10 minutes. I think I'm going to actually hop around to the different rooms you all are in just to kind of chat with you and see how it's going. Were any of those particularly challenging to try to diagnose or come up with examples?
We only got through 2.
We only,
Mhm.
yeah. But it was interesting because each of us had encountered the exact situation of the 2 questions. So we were able to talk about how we handled it and where we thought it fit in the norms. And it kind of worked.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad the examples I picked just sort of out of nowhere happened to be reasonable enough sounding to be real. So yeah, I'll really quickly, because I know we don't have time to go all around, but I'm just going to give you my once off on like how I thought about those things. But we don't have quite enough time to like go through each group, unfortunately, I don't think. So I'll do that just in case you were like, what did he intend for this? So here's what I intended, at least. And I did make these a little ambiguous. So there could be multiple concerns or doubts that person had, right? But the ones I intended, at least, the first one, when somebody says, I just don't think our city can reach net zero, I thought that'd be a good example of someone just doubting change was possible. Like, I don't think we're able to do this. And so you might say, well, a lot of cities like yours are actually making those goals. Like, they're setting them and reaching them. Like, they're like 5-10 year plans, like they're getting it done. So I don't see any reason why your town couldn't. Many towns are starting to. The homeowner says, I'd be the only one who might block with solar. It sounds like they're worried that most people don't do this, right? That it's like particularly counter-normative. And you could be like, I'm looking at signups in your town and the numbers are just going up. Like, this is the direction things are going to go. This is how things are going to look in the future. If a Republican mayor told you, we're not a bunch of tree huggers here, I just don't think spending on EV charging stations is going to go over too well. Then you might be inclined to try to find some more information about similar types of cities, right? And say, a lot of cities that never did this before, including red ones, are starting to move in this direction and install things. And they think it's going to be a good deal. They know that their constituents care about the fact that, they're a good investment up front and it's going to, be good for them, right? You can try to put things into those sort of terms if you want. Or, certain red cities are starting to make this change and they're, doing it under the banner of energy independence, right? You could frame it however you want, but evidence that with other people changing. And then that last one, your neighbor says, is weatherizing really worth all the trouble? I took that to be an example of someone just doubting this was important enough to do. And you could go, a lot of people are starting to do this. And really what they say is the comfort is great and the savings is great. And it really wasn't that bad. And so you try to persuade people by using evidence of other people changing, right, as like a good counter argument to these different concerns they have.
Hey, Greg, just a quick question on that. Most of this is examples from other places or other people. How important is it to share like quotes from people versus just stats? Your neighbor Greg said, I was worried that weatherization thing was going to take 6 months and I'd have to make 42 decisions. And it turned out I got it done in 3 months, blah, 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 versus just kind of quoting non-personal, you understand my question.
Yeah. So people use both kinds of evidence, right? We process both. I think that narratives about individuals might stick. But sometimes people you're talking to are going to be like, that's just an anecdote. I don't care. Like, they just want to know something broader than that. And so I think it's going to depend a little bit on the audience and the space and like what sounds more appropriate. If it's super conversational, it's kind of weird to start rolling out statistics or something maybe, right? So maybe like 1 or 2 anecdotes matches better in that context. But if you're like presenting to a city council and you want to be persuasive, like maybe a couple stats are going to be better than that. So I think there's a little time and a place and knowing your audience to determine how should I craft this message. Should it be about a handful of people that are salient stories, or should it be about broader trends that are really going to persuade someone who's like bean counting or something, right? Okay. On to the second of 4 topics, and the rest will go much quicker. So should advocates walk the walk? In this case, I'm thinking about climate advocates, and there's been a lot of questions sometimes raised about, if I'm advocating for climate policy, like what's my lifestyle like? And people might bring that into the conversation. So for instance, we can remember when Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth came out, that shortly thereafter, there was like these kind of press releases attacking him and noting that his house devoured 20 times more energy than the national average, right? And I think we might be quick to kind of dismiss this kind of a criticism as just being like an ad hominem attack, like it's just somebody with a political axe to grind, and that's the only reason they're bringing this up. But at the same time, if you put yourself in the shoes of somebody who is not a climate activist, somebody who works in the service sector, or I give the example of a bank teller or a nurse, and you try to picture that person, they might not know how big of a deal this climate kind of issue is in large, and they might say like, should I personally take action right now? Is it really that kind of a problem? Is it something I should treat like an emergency or give it a higher priority than other parts of my life? Like these might be realistic questions to get somebody to take action on something right now. And they might ask, well, are the advocates treating it like an emergency, right? And suddenly all the things you do might become relevant points of inference for them. Like you might be saying something, but I'm not seeing you do it in every aspect of your life. Like it could feel like a mixed message to people, even people who aren't politically out to get you. They could just be people reasonably unsure what the situation is and trying to interpret it as best they can. And so one kind of example I've seen for this is, people who themselves have solar tend to be better advocates for persuading others to get rooftop solar, right? As opposed to someone going around door to door who doesn't happen to have it themselves. And it's not that they necessarily were asked to bring this up. It's just like this pans out, and often it comes up enough that it became an issue. But this is also true at the policy level. Like people who try to persuade someone, for instance, to support a climate policy is going to actually be more effective if it's known about that person that they also live a sustainable lifestyle. So even those things feel pretty disparate, but people still make those connections, and it still seems to matter. At the same time, there's this opposing pitfall you could also fall into, which is people who are goody two-shoes also make us upset. So someone who has exemplary behavior might also be disliked. And this happens because there's this process where we might see someone doing exceptionally well at something, and then we might feel judged or bad about our own shortcomings. And so then we're motivated to derogate that exemplar and marginalize their cause. And this helps us no longer feel bad about our own shortcomings, right? And this is called do-gooder derogation. And it's been shown for a variety of things. Like when people take the moral high ground, people become really big targets for this, but also for things just like choosing to not eat meat, or even smaller things like just I'm using less packaging, like things that don't seem like they would be hot points morally can still produce this kind of effect. So exactly how sustainable should sustainable advocates be? And do we need to avoid both these kind of hypocrisy critiques and these do-gooder derogation critiques, or what? Like, how does that work? And I'm not really telling you the actual nuts and bolts of all these studies, just the kind of takeaways from them, by the way, given our time. But the takeaways here were that we found that unsustainable advocates were by far the least persuasive compared to moderately sustainable and highly sustainable advocates. Especially, they were judged harshly if they were supposed to be experts and they weren't sustainable. They got judged really hard. But we also noticed that people who were extremely sustainable were not more persuasive than the ones that were moderately sustainable. In fact, they were marginally worse. And it seems like this wasn't because people thought they were less credible, but they were just less likable and less relatable. So, and by the way, when we say fairly sustainable or moderately sustainable, the criteria we had were actually still doing a lot. Like this person was making changes to their diet. They avoided flying when possible. They bought 100% renewable energy. It was just people who did even more than that, where they did like everything, basically. Like extreme was extreme in this case. So our conclusions from that research is that environmental advocates actually do have to avoid both these hypocrisy concerns and this do-gooder derogation that's out there. And to do so, you should probably walk the walk, but you really do need to take care that you don't seem too extreme while doing it. Like there is sort of a sweet spot that we think exists for this kind of thing. Okay, The next one, this is going to be a quick one. Psychological distance, here and now climate change. Some things are seen as psychologically distant, which just means they're distant either spatially, like they're far away from me geographically. They're temporally distant. They're just far in the future. They're socially distant. They affect people who are different than me. Or they're distant in terms of certainty, which just means it's unclear if that's going to happen, right? So climate change can be seen potentially as distant along all of these dimensions. And the bad news is that people are more concerned about things when they seem close rather than distant. That might not surprise you. Also, we did a study where we show that policies are favored when the benefits appear to be near rather than far along any of these dimensions. But the thing with climate change is you can really frame it either way. You can kind of highlight the things that are going to happen here now to people like you and that are awfully certain to happen. Or you could focus on the bigger picture, but it seems like having it focus on some of the real content, particularly when it comes to policy benefits, like here's the benefits of this policy, that tends to be more effective. So that's the takeaway from that one, just one slide basically for that one. And then the last one here is what I'm going to call the consistency challenge. And it's that climate change sort of, if we want to be sustainable, there's a lot of things we can do, right? We can switch from driving to riding a bike. We can switch from planes to trains. Climate change might have us consider changing our diets. We might consider changing many things about our home. We might consider how we change, or we might consider change in our waste, our consumer habits, and how we spend our free time. Like all these things are up for grabs and are domains of our life that pertain to climate change. And it feels like it's really asking us to make many changes day after day, consistently for the duration of our lives, which is a pretty big ask. And so the question becomes, well, how can we motivate people to take consistent action, not just do one thing once, but to do many things for hopefully a long time? So this kind of leads into a discussion of positive spillover and negative spillover. So when we're consistent from time one to time two, like I did this and I keep doing it, or I do this and I do similar things, that's called consistency or positive spillover. And some research shows there's a few reasons we do this. One is that sometimes we're actually not certain how we feel about something, and we actually observe our own behavior to infer if I care about something or not. So if I take action, I infer that maybe I do care about this issue. There's also dissonance, which is if I feel like I'm being inconsistent, like oh, I said this, but I did the other thing. I don't like that. That feels aversive. And so I might be motivated to be more consistent, either change my attitude or behavior to match the other. So these things motivate people to be consistent over time. But there's also motivation to be inconsistent, or theories that support this idea of negative spillover from one thing to making it unlikely to do something in the future. So one of these ideas is moral licensing. A specific version of it's moral accounting. There's way too many terms for the same idea, sorry. But the idea is we have this threshold of how good of a person we want to be. And I do a good deed and I feel pretty good about myself, like I'm doing good on the good scale. And then I feel entitled. I get this moral license moment where I feel like it's okay if I slack off now because I just did a good thing a little bit ago. And then I do a bad deed and I feel kind of bad about myself. Now I have to do some kind of moral compensation where I do a good deed. And we kind of live in this jigsaw of adequacy where I'm not doing every good deed that comes my way, but I'm at least doing some, enough to be as good of a person as I want by my standard. There's also this idea of the single action bias where I do one thing and I just feel better about the whole domain. There's some research suggesting that happens for climate. And so what leads people down one of these paths to either be more consistent or to accrue negative spillover in licensing? Like what gears people toward, because both are possible. Well, when people think about things in abstract terms, when they like reflect on things in really broad ways, they're more likely to be consistent. So if I ask myself, why do I do these behaviors? If I ask these kind of big questions, I'm more likely to be consistent. But if I focus just on the concrete, what did I do? And that's it. It's not like a deep question. It's like, I already took action. Then I can feel like I don't need to, I can rest on my laurels. If people also identify with that behavior, be like, that behavior relates to something about myself, like a quality I have or a group I'm a part of or something about me that I identify with, I'm more likely to be consistent with that thing in the future. But if I have no identification with that behavior, like I did it, but I make no connection to who I am, what I care about, or groups I'm a part of, I'm more likely to license in the future and to not do more. Also, if I think about this behavior and reflect on how it connects to my values, I'm more likely to be consistent with that kind of behavior in the future. But if I don't reflect at all, I'm more likely to license and rest on my laurels. If I frame an action as being, oh, I did this because I'm very committed to it, I'm more likely to be consistent in the future versus if I say, I did this and I've made so much progress already. Then I'm more likely to feel like I've already made a lot of progress. Maybe I can slack off. And then also similar research has found that when we make judgments and we're considering things like, what are the societal rules that I think people should live by, or what are the roles that I have as like a parent or some kind of social role, I'm more likely to be consistent in my actions. But if I think about, oh, I just feel guilty once, so now I want to do an action, then I'm more likely to get licensing. So some takeaways from this research are that negative spillover can occur in the environmental policy and behavior space. So when people don't connect their actions to why they act sustainably, if they don't make connections to their identity or values, they're more likely to slack off in the future. And also, when it comes to framing things like policies, if you frame them as having all the costs fall on individuals, they'll start searching for reasons why maybe they don't need to pass that policy, like I've already done X, Y, Z in my life, right? And so those things can come at each other's cost. However, people can internalize, and if they do, they're actually more likely to support policies in that case. Like if I take sustainable actions, most of the time what seems to happen is that people become greater supporters of climate policy later on. That's like the average effect. And so behavior and policy don't really need to be considered substitutes. Most people actually see them as complements in this way. And I think behavior campaigns, though, should also just help people internalize the actions, like don't leave it to chance. So for instance, you might have a campaign where you're trying to promote some kind of green behavior. Sometimes you see campaigns using labels like this, do this and it will fix climate change. And I would suggest that's a bad kind of banner to advertise your behavior under, because you're suggesting to people that the problem will go away after they do this thing, and so they're not likely to take more actions on it. If instead you say, we're really committed to decarbonizing society, that's why we do these things, you put it under a bigger banner, then you're more likely to see this kind of be inclusive to political action, voting, etc. All right, thank you so much. Hopefully I'm not way too over time, and happy to do questions.
You did great, Greg, and we have Amy tells me until 8:20 for questions. I'm going to scan the chat here and throw some at you from the chat, and then people should feel free to raise their hands with the reaction button or put it in the chat, and then I will. So Amy had asked, what are the impacts of framing the benefits of climate policies as falling on others distant in time and space as opposed to those in the here and now? What are the impacts of framing the benefits as falling in the, you got that?
Yes. So in my work, like the further we put it in time or distance geographically, the less people supported the policy, which is sort of sad, right? Like you would hope that's not true, but I don't know. When we ask people to pick between policies and prioritize different ones, they put ones that benefit others in the distant future and not places here lower. They just value them. It seemed to be less.
Okay. I'm just looking for questions that are not Amy and me. Others have questions here that they want to throw at Greg? You threw a ton of stuff at you. Cindy, I see your hand up. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Greg. This was so great. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if you can talk about if there's any way we should approach people differently, individuals that we're trying to make a change, people in our community that we're trying to get to put heat pumps in their house or solar on their roof, versus elected officials, town or city employees to try and embrace some sort of policy or some sort of change. So it's like they're still individual people that we're talking to, but they're sort of more responsible for some bigger change. And of all, I know that you gave that in some of your examples, but can you talk about how we might do that, or what things might we do differently? Maybe nothing, but that's what I want to know. Thanks.
That's a great question. And one disclaimer I should give generally is that for empirical research, that's like, we experimentally show something works better than something else. We're often confined to not doing research on decision makers. Like they're just not in our labs that often, right? It's like harder to get a hold of them. So I would say that there's a need for research that somehow manages to get access to them and do research on them. And I'm actually doing some of that research. Like we've started doing surveys with local decision makers. There actually are panels like that, but that stuff is in its nascency. However, what I will say is that a lot of what we found to be true of the general public is often true of decision makers too. So I can give some kind of anecdotal examples. One was I was promoting this energy saving. It was sort of energy saving program to cities, and I was going to different cities. And the question I often got, I would explain it that in this, it was actually part of an app to, like, when people were using this, it gave them information about their neighbors, and that would persuade people to do more actions. And I was kind of explaining the motivation inside of this thing. And then city officials would kind of like nod. They'd be like, great, are other cities doing this too? And I was like, I just got done explaining to you how I use social influence to persuade people to do things. And now you're asking me if other cities do it too. Like, my answer, of course, is going to be more and more cities are starting to do this. Like, but they, you know, even in a moment where you think they would be kind of on guard against such persuasion attempts, they're just as susceptible as always. And it's because they're reasonable things. They're reasonable ways to make a judgment about these things, right? So if you're a city official and you want to know if something's a good idea, it's good to look around and see what other cities are doing, particularly other cities like yours. So a lot of the applications I just mentioned seem to apply pretty well to decision makers in the cases where I've been able to observe it. And I think that's true of the consistency. Like, oh, you did this because you're committed to this, is better than you did this and you've already made tons of progress on that issue. You probably don't want to frame it that way. You want to frame it as like they're committed. And when it comes to norms, yeah, I think even if something's uncommon, you can portray it as getting more popular by cities over time. When it comes to the here and now, I think they have an intuition their constituents care about it that way too. So they're probably going to vote that way. Yeah, I think that, oh, and then for the do-gooder derogation, I think, yeah, even city officials might judge somebody by these kind of what seem like arbitrary qualities, right? I mean, yeah, they're human is the short answer, but I think you can often tailor the message to be not just about others, but about other people like them, right?
All right, Greg,
So
I got 7 questions I want to buzz through.
Okay, yeah.
So you're
So
going to...
that's what I know for now. And then they probably like a better mix of anecdote and data, right? Than just anecdote.
All right,
would
we're
be
going to
my
go
intuition.
rapid fire, Greg. You're going to give us your best shot on these. And
Okay.
we'll save the chat and we can send your responses in an email later. And we'll have you. All right. Steve asks, are there gateway actions, think gateway drugs, that are more likely than others to cause the doers to be more consistent about sustainable actions?
We haven't done an analysis on which behaviors are more likely to bleed over than others. But from what we do know, the ones that sort of map onto some kind of identity, or that people can obviously go, oh, I do that behavior because of this value I have, should be more likely to spread further. So some behaviors come with identities, like probably like riding a bike, you're more likely to think of yourself as a cyclist, for instance. But other behaviors maybe don't come with an identity so easily because your participation in them is sort of invisible, or, you know, there's no way for you to there's not like an identity out there that exists for that behavior. So I think that would be the ones, I would say small ones, but ones you can still scaffold onto like some moral value they have or identity are probably the best foot in the doors.
Okay. Next, if changing norms is our goal, then the more we talk about effective programs and solutions, the more people will change their behavior. Have we got that right?
I hope so. I mean, you do, and I hope it's true, because you would think there should be some kind of tipping point for a lot of these things if that's true, right? That after things start getting momentum and people start looking around, that there's hopefully a moment where things get easier.
Okay. If the big companies and governments don't act big time, what does it matter if I take small actions? We get this all the time.
Yeah. So there's a few reasons it matters. One is that people need to start thinking about themselves as a social agent. Like, you're part of a system, right? If you do things, it's not a tree falling in the woods where no one hears it. You're surrounded by things who might notice you. And so a lot of our research shows that even when a small group of people start doing something, a larger segment might start conforming to that behavior if they perceive that as the direction things are going. So it kind of lends credence to the old Margaret Mead quote that even a small group of individuals can make change. Perhaps it's the only thing that ever has.
Right. Moving through these, this is a nice one from Barry. So how to get folks to move beyond general support for, he works in a Jewish congregation. He said, how to get folks move beyond general support for congregational change, but not willing to change personally their behavior. It seems like some people are like, oh yeah, like we'll work on our building and our congregation, but sort of are less likely to somehow want to do it in their own lives. And Barry also asked a unrelated but question, but it's the same guy. He said, listening to you, should we rebrand our green team to a green movement?
Maybe. I mean, I think it's not enough necessarily just to say a change is happening. You want people to really believe it's the direction things are going. So if you think you can do that persuasively, go for it.
Okay.
But you want people to really think like that's the direction things are heading.
So
Because sometimes it can be empty words. And you gotta make sure people like believe you when you give these change messages. And then for the congregation question, I do think that there's a foot in the door insofar as like they're taking action. You're like, great, get them to identify with it, get them to explicate why it maps onto their values and morals. And soon they're going to kind of find themselves in like a moral corner where it feels really weird to not do these things at home.
Can you give an example of how, like, you could get somebody in a congregation to identify with the same thing would be in a town, like a town that just passed CCA, guys, right? And we're all going to go with green electricity. We did it to you, and you think that's cool, but you still haven't done something in your own house. So how do we translate support for a centralized decision to reverberate through at the household level?
Yeah, I think that essentially like rev up the fanfare. Right? Like kind of be like, we're a green city, I'm a green mayor, like whatever it is, right? Like start like putting, either getting people to make those statements themselves or making them about them. Like either way, but you want them to really, and then if you can, kind of put them on the spot a little bit and be like, you know, you didn't have to do this. You know, tell me why you felt this was morally an important thing to do for your values, right? And like get them to generate the explanation for why this maps onto things they care about. And then you're starting to kind of build up, right, this kind of like dissonance if they're not doing other things. And that's kind of what you want to keep doing. And then you kind of got to, I would sort of, if you know your audience well, you can decide like when you think you have enough leverage, basically, right? Because if it's too soon, they're just going to back off from the whole thing and be like, look, I just did this because you asked me to, right? So you got to kind of build them up.
Okay. Kat asks, and I'm going to read it, Kat, but I'm not sure I really understand the question. Is that a version of distance also at work in numbers? The higher the number, the less we relate. So Kat, I'm actually not sure I understand that question.
Yeah, I think I understand. So one version of this question might be, do we stop caring when it becomes not just an individual, but a group of people who are suffering? Right. And then there's the quote, right, that a individual is a person in a statistic or group's a statistic or something. But I think that there is work on what people have called the collapse of compassion, which is when some issue becomes so big that I can't fathom how to fix it, I preemptively feel less compassion. So people don't, it's not that people see a amount of suffering and then feel the equivalent amount of compassion. It's not like a linear relationship. Instead, what happens is at some point there's too much suffering and I just preemptively turn off my own compassion. Right? And specifically the level is, I don't see how this can get fixed. And that's where, so you can tell people that bad things will happen, but you have to make sure that they feel like there's something they're able to do or at least help do to solve that problem. You want to give those two things in equal amounts to people when you're presenting them with fodder to be worried about. It's things could be terrible, but you can do something about it. Like you can't just give the first one or else people are going to feel awful. So sometimes problems become too big and you've lost them on like, I can do something about it.
All right, Amy, you're going to cut me off when I have to be cut off, but I think I have a few more I can throw in, right, Amy? Okay. So Gilda asks, have you seen any research on how people in liberal towns respond to policies that mandate certain behaviors, requiring homes to be fossil fuel, which they're doing in Gilda's town of Concord, requiring existing homes to replace defunct heating systems that are fossil fuel with heat pumps? Even in liberal towns, how do we respond to mandates?
It's a good question. I haven't seen work on that specific topic, but I can think of a adjacent one that might be relevant, which is looking at things like a soda tax or other things where there's kind of an infringement on things people were used to deciding for themselves in some way. And generally what you find is that for policies like that, initially there is more opposition. And then when you tell people it's very likely to pass, the opposition starts to diminish. And when it actually passes, the opposition goes even lower. So there's this natural, like, it's not the status quo and I dislike it. And then you tell people, actually, it's going to happen. They go, I guess it's the status quo and maybe it's not so bad. Like people want to emotionally not hate life. And so they tend to adjust their perspective on things when they have to. And so I think for a lot of things like that, it would definitely fall in that camp. So you should expect the most opposition early on. You could probably try to tell policymakers that. I don't know if they believe you, but you could tell them like, people are going to be upset about this for like 2 weeks. and then it's going to roll out and they're going to get over it. Like look at the plastic bag ban or look at all these things. You can kind of watch this little hump. Same thing.
It'd be
I
good.
think like e-cigarette ban, like there's been bans that this happens and you kind of see that same like, that's fine. Yeah.
Any research on ways to reach religious groups, care for poor, promotion of common good versus personal belief as motivating values? I think you trying to use Pope Francis's called to the Catholics. So is there a different frame that might be effective with religious groups, do you think, versus the motivating value?
Yeah. So one thing I didn't talk about here explicitly is one of the 4 things I talked about is values reframing. But the idea is you try to match the values of the target audience for the thing you're selling. And you can sell the same thing many ways, right? That kind of basic segmentation and tailoring idea. When it comes to religious groups, there's a few lines of research generally which say that stewardship messages do better than justice messages. Like what you're doing is hurting people doesn't necessarily play as well. Although if it's the kind of church that really cares about justice, then that would be fine. But if it's like an evangelical church and you come up then with like a social justice argument, it's not going to go well, probably. And instead, like stewardship of the land kind of argument is probably going to go better.
Okay. And I think I'm on my last one, so it'll be perfect timing, Amy. So Alex notes, there was a question earlier saying, big companies really aren't doing anything, so why does my little thing make a difference? Alex notes like more and more big companies are in fact acting, so it's important to emphasize that. So how would you play, that also seems like one of these growing trend things. It's like, not only are your neighbors doing this, but Google's made this commitment. Gunderson Health System has made this commitment. Thoughts about that? How to use that momentum?
I think generally using examples of organizations doing things and then sort of asking people like, do you think a company or government official will ever do anything if people never do anything, right? Like, do you think they're just going to spontaneously do it? Or do you think you have to take any and all kinds of actions at your disposal to make them think people care about the issue, right? Like it's, it seems like, I can also say too, like I've actually, one of the things I did
say that again. Can you just say that again? Because you're really good at
answering. Too many negatives in there. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I think I followed it, but it actually was a pretty important point, and I'd like to take a second. Yeah.
I think there's no reason to suspect that companies or decision makers will take action if you don't. Right? Is like a short way of saying it. Like if you think they're just going to voluntarily do it, that's great. For the same reason they're pessimistic already, they shouldn't suspect that'll happen. So instead, you probably want to use every lever at your disposal if you think it's an important issue. For the people who already agree it's an important issue. And then I think the other thing is like, yeah, companies are motivated by PR. We see them, there's like a kind of constant battle for what companies care about, right? And is environment on that list or not? Well, it depends if it seems like people actually care about that or not, right? They're doing focus groups, they're asking people questions, they're doing all kinds of stuff. And decision makers too. In fact, one of the first questions I asked in a decision maker sample that I got to run, this was like a new service, which I was like really excited to be able to survey decision makers, was if your constituents changed many things about their lives and started living more sustainably, would you advocate more strongly for climate policies? Now it's not, they can lie, right? But at least the majority say yes, including the majority of Republicans. So it's interesting to note that like almost 60% of Republicans said yes to that question. So, there's some hope in that.
Well, one of the things that we're trying to do, Greg, in all of our communities is like track what people are doing. So I'm not sure we all do a good job of sharing that up the chain with our political, our Board of Selectmen, our City Council or whatnot. Interesting. I think I'm at the last one. One of our community organizers from Boxborough said, hey, would you be willing to talk to some of our sustainability committees if we could do it on Zoom, Greg? I don't know how often you're willing to do these, but we certainly could do some follow-ups with multiple sustainability committees so we don't make Greg do a zillion talks.
Yeah, to the extent that I could give one rather than many would be good. I'm happy to just send me an email so I can figure out how much of a pace I can do these things generally as I continue doing research. But I'm excited to, and I think it's an important thing for folks in my situation to collaborate with folks in your situations because I'm going to learn a lot too, and I hope to. And like I'm essentially like I dabbled in activism and now I'm like guessing as to the topics that would be important research topics based on those experiences. So the more things that I hear from you is really helpful to help guide me in determining like what kind of research hasn't been done yet, but seems really helpful potentially. I kind of started with that list that I went off with, which is like, how do you get people to do stuff that's not the norm right now? That's like a huge barrier. And like, how do you get people to be consistent? Because they'll do one thing and then just slack off. Or like, how do you, a lot of these questions seem to be mainstays. And I was like, I think we can make progress on those, generally speaking. So I'd be excited to, it's just a question of like pace and how much time I got.
We can work with you on that. Let's help do some interfacing. In my 40 seconds as moderator, I get to ask my question here, which is, so at the beginning you had a bunch of dynamic norms. I'm not sure I'm not sure we have enough direct interaction with a lot of the people that we're trying to reach. We send newsletters, people open them, we have events, but I'm not sure we ask questions to help diagnose the norms. The people who are vocal, we can diagnose what they've told us, but are there ways you think we should be more actively trying to understand essentially what is the stickiness for them?
There's definitely a strategic question to this, but I wouldn't, and given that I'm not someone operating a nonprofit, right, I can only guess at that, but my intuition is that spending a little bit of time, not just trying to develop solutions, but first starting with like, well, what's their issue? Seems immensely valuable, right? So to the extent that you can take time and figure out like, well, why don't you do the behavior I hope you do? Like, and start asking those questions and developing some sense of what it is that they aren't doing. You're gonna have a much better time developing a solution for it. A lot of times people just see a problem and they jump right into solution phase. But I think trying to understand why people aren't doing the thing you want them to do first is really valuable. Because there's like 1,000 ways you could try to approach it. Engaging which one and how hard to push and all that stuff is going to depend on stuff in my mind. So,
okay, that might be. Greg's not off the hook with us after this session, so I think maybe I'd love to hear people's thoughts at the end, maybe, or throw them in the chat when we come back together, or follow up to this on how we could use Greg's research and come up with some more tools that we could use across communities for all of us. So, Amy, I think I'm handing it back to you now.
Yep. Thank you, Greg. That was just a wonderful talk, and we're going to continue to talk about it and talk about your research going forward. Our next, and I actually really like that last point that we need to really stop and listen. We're hearing that in multiple themes of our lives these days. Like, why aren't people doing things? And I see that just kind of a lack of understanding into other people's lives and priorities, and there's just I think the marketing people really kind of get this. So we can all learn from marketing a bit. Anyways, sorry to take your time. We are going to move into breakout rooms where we can all talk about these in a little more depth, what we've learned tonight. And then really importantly, we would like you to hopefully come away with an idea, an actionable idea of something you're going to do from tonight, whether that's changing a message in your own communities and how you're having a conversation, whether it's starting to think about how to change a dynamic norm. Just try and identify something that you're inspired by tonight that you can go and put right into action. So with that, Kat, I think, is going to assign us randomly once again to breakout rooms.
And in your breakout room, if there's something that the action is something that you think Mass Energize can do, that's also a little inbounds, I think, Amy.
So we have now Stump the Speaker, hard challenges, and just what folks thought from their breakout rooms. I have a good one to start you with, Greg. It's not entirely on the dynamic of convincing your community. Rather, it is on the dynamic of how do we use your norms and ideas to convince people to help all of us. We are having trouble recruiting people to spread the message, to share the work. Any advice in that regard?
Yeah, I think with like the tools I've kind of mentioned today are pretty broad in terms of how you might want to use them. If my goal was to Now, is it getting someone who's taking like 1 or 2 actions to stick around? Is it getting someone
No,
who's
I
never
think
done anything
someone else
do
to
something?
help to be more volunteers in our leadership circles within each of our
Yeah.
communities. There's a burnout on climate advocates. So Amy's got, 4 people in Framingham. She'd like her volunteer base of organizers to be 12.
And is the problem that people never start, or they start and burn out specifically? Or
A
both?
lot of it's never start. There's a
Never
lot of
start.
never starting.
Okay. I think in that scenario, I would probably leverage people's existing social ties. So
Mhm.
like friends of the people who are doing things with you are going to have additional motivation to do it.
Mhm.
Like they'll have social motivation because it's done with friends.
Mhm.
And so you're kind of leveraging the sort of co-benefits. Not only might be these be good for the environment and your community, but you get to spend time with people you like, right?
Yeah.
And that's like a very specific way I would do it. And then give people sort of small things that they can do and enjoy, and kind of scaffold on larger ones as time goes on. And then start giving people ways to I would even invent like really, really small things people can do that aren't necessarily that helpful for your organization. Just so they do anything and put a name on a list or whatever, right?
Uh-huh.
And ice cream social or whatever it is, right? Like, and I think those are the kinds of things you do so that people, because I think there's a lot of scary things. If you've never done anything, you're like, I don't know what this group's about. I don't know what it's going to be like when I'm there. I don't know, there's just a lot of things you're trying to overcome at once. And so if you kind of break that down bit by bit by giving them really small things, and then try to scaffold it onto what they care about and who they are and the way they see themselves and their identity. And you can also persuade them, right, that other people are joining, or like it's, a lot of people, this is their first group they ever joined. This is a great starter group. You could even call it something like that, right? To try to make it seem like it's normal for someone who's never been active in this way to start. Like you can kind of frame change that way too. Those are highlighting some of the things I talked about today, ways you could kind of translate it to that issue, I think.
Yeah, that's really good. Did anyone else have hopefully we can have time for 1 or 2, like burning, really hard questions or examples of ways you're going to apply the research?
Susan? And
Amy, yeah, Ellen, I can just share one of my takeaways that I think I can use. We work a lot with underserved communities who've never accessed basic mass save offerings. And it's the challenge of the state, and it's a perennial challenge. And I'm just training someone now to be our community ambassador in partnership with our education program. And it just hit me when you talked about listening, that I've been focusing a lot on training her on all the programs and this, that, and the other. But I think I'm going to start talking to her a lot more about how to listen. She's a young activist, very energetic person from the community. And I appreciate the underscoring on the listening part. So thank you for that.
Ellen from Harvard?
Barry might have had his hand up first, but
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that, Barry. I'm on a different screen. Do you want to go first, Barry, and then Ellen?
Oh, you're still muted.
Thanks. First is, I loved everything. I thought it was great. But I think the values, and for me, it's a Jewish community and the Jewish values of repairing the earth. And it's been played up during our high holidays. And I want to dovetail that and probably have a meeting with our rabbi to just see the best ways to further that. I think that's the biggest thing, but also this getting a little bit more of the stories of the people who are in our community who have made those changes, and how to position how easy it was for them and how relatable they are, and not as a moderate advocate, not as an extreme advocate, as a way to see that, yeah, if they could do it, why can't I? Because we have several examples.
Yeah, anytime that you can take existing changes people are making and then just make them more noticeable or salient is better. I wonder too, I'm not an expert by any means on sort of Jewish community values, but I know there's a big emphasis on like doing the right thing and not taking credit for it, as far as I understand.
Yeah, it's a higher,
Even better.
right.
Yeah, it's the highest form of giving is to be anonymous.
I wonder if there's a tricky thing when it comes to the environment. You're doing good for others indirectly. I wonder if people hesitate in broadcasting they're doing those things because of that value, and I wonder if there's some way to circumvent that in this context that requires a novel approach.
The curse of the silent tzedakah. Okay, yeah.
Like letting people know, like, it's great to not take credit, etc., but you want people to copy you, and you could be enormously influential.
Right.
Like, letting them know that that's something to consider in the mix.
Yeah. I'll be mindful of that. I didn't even think about that, but you're right. Thanks.
Helen?
No, I was just going to say that we're lucky in Harvard. We have a very local paper, and I'm thinking that the Mass Energize, as we roll out, we just started rolling it out, that we need to put the data in there a lot more often. We don't ever spit in. We do a lot of work, but we don't ever spit anything back out there that says, look where we are, and again, influence other people because they can see how much has been done. So I think I'm going to keep a note of that as we move forward, as long as we get enough people to sign up, that we can then push the data out and show people what's happening. That's what I got out of it.
That's great. Fantastic. Folks, we are wrapping up. We're just about out of time. Want to give a huge thank you to Greg. This has been a great event. And for all of you organizers, I just looked at the calendar. Our next second Tuesday would be October 11th, which is Indigenous Peoples Days. So we have to think about whether we'll hold it that day or shift it. And the other piece we wanted to mention is that there's a number of communities looking to hopefully doing a virtual event on green heating and cooling. And we need organizers. If folks are interested in participating in that event, in participating in the event, we need people to help make it happen. So if you are interested, please reach out and by email. We'll include that also in the follow-up email along with Greg's slides and the link to the recording. So with that, Ellen's gonna say goodnight.
I'm going to say goodnight and just say the two topics we had for our next meetings, we're going to see if, now, Ricky, I know you guys are having Senator Barrett, I think, on tomorrow night, but we were thinking of having Senator Barrett talk about sort of what's next after passing the big legislation. So we'll see if we can get Mike for the next meeting. But the other topic that got a lot of interest was sort of what's the cutting edge next thing everyone's trying to do in their community at a policy level. A lot of people have done CCA, some people are doing fossil fuel bans, Newton's got an electrification ordinance. So we thought we might kind of share what's that next pushing the envelope at a local level. Those were the two topics that sort of came up. So if you have other ones, but felt like those had a fair amount of energy the last time around. And I really want to think about how we can actualize some of Greg's research and put it in action, and then share how that's working with us and with Greg. We'll send you a follow-up email, and we'd be very interested if there's something you think we can do with Greg that would be helpful to you guys.
Great. Thank you so much for having me tonight. You all seem like a very dedicated and impressive group of folks doing really exciting stuff. So I'm really impressed, and hopefully the work I'm doing can be of use, and I'm happy to chat more with people or answer follow-up questions. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye,
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Let's see, I'm going to stand for 1 second.
Yeah.
So Greg, I want to say thanks. I thought you did a nice job. It's a ton of information, so I think people might even listen to the recording again. It was a lot to try to digest.
Yeah.
But I think it got people thinking differently about what they're doing. I hope that was the idea, and I think that happened. Kat, you haven't heard Greg before. Kat reads a ton of other stuff, but I assume, Kat, there were a few nuggets you even picked up tonight.
Oh yeah. And a lot rang a bell, like just anecdotally, like, oh yeah, I've seen that. So yeah, that was great. I'd love to be part of, any kind of group or team that follows up and continues. And I was also going to say, Greg, if ever you're looking for people to experiment on,
Yeah, we're a game.
yeah, we're here.
I mean, I was thinking about the Mass Energize like website systems where people are like signing up and then they're saying, I want to do X actions. Then you can see if they actually do those actions, right? Because they commit and then later they say if they actually did them or not.
Yep.
So they give a really big capacity to figure out what works experimentally. Like you can just, A/B test, like randomize people to two versions of a thing and see like, oh, that group did better. Let's start using that method, right? And just
right. Well, we haven't done
iterating.
that. Yeah, we got people with stuff on their to-do list, and we haven't actually done so much reaching out with nudges to them. So we could try some different messaging. I think in my group, people are saying it's just hard to know what people's values are. Like they've signed up for a platform, they're on our listserv, but we don't really know their motivating values. We don't know, and it's hard to get them to open. I think there's a tremendous email fatigue. People aren't. We used to have higher click rate openings, and those are going down. I don't know. Maybe it's just also COVID, and everyone's just beat. So it's just it's hard to figure out how to assess that. There's a lot of one-on-one talking, but that that's very time consuming. So
I
think
also
we're
think
struggling.
there's.
I gotta sign off. Good night.
Oh,
Thank
bye,
you,
Amy.
Greg.
Thanks, Amy.
Amy.
Yeah, actually, and we can.
Yeah, we can
I'm
talk
sure
about
we can talk for forever, but one of the things I wanted to ask was that we could talk about later is we as activists are very averse to having an ethical conversation with people. There's this like, oh, you don't pry, or I don't know, all the cultural stuff that could be going on, and I think because we're talking about norms all the time, this is really a sticky problem. Like how do you bring ethics into the conversation without being too off-putting and without being judgmental? And I think that's a big one as well. But
that's a good question. I think it maps on to what we're talking about a second ago. Like, well, how do we know what people care about? I mean, I've seen organizations that do super brief onboarding where they say like, we have a lot of reasons why people join this organization. We would love to know like which of these top 3 kind of like call to you most, right? What are the things that excite you and motivate you? And I think when you stick to the positive, people don't get as upset about it. Right.
Yeah.
Like, although at the same time, like in a lot of cases, people are motivated by guilt, right? That could be like a legit motivation. But I think that framing it in the positive is more certain to not offend, probably.
Yeah.
So, more carrots than
That
sticks.
might be something interesting we might think about with the platform is after people sign up, they get a quick little pop-up, which they don't have to answer. They'd say, we're curious about what motivated you to join the community. And we could start to, even if we got 20, 30 kind of response and we start to get some data, we can enable that in the software, I think, Kat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ultimately, if you have the ability to build in whatever it requires to make A/B testing really, really easy, like not just like reprogram a thing twice every time, but like make a system that can split things really easily, whatever that looks like on the back end, that would be a good payoff.
I think
for
we're
a lot
getting
of things.
closer to that. Yeah, we're getting closer to that.
Maybe. All right, I'm going to sign off.
Lots to
Debbie
talk
has a
about.
question she can ask, but Greg, thanks again. But
Yep.
you had 25, super motivated community activists. So hopefully your research gets out there into the field.
Yeah,
Hi, Debbie.
thank you.
I'm gonna sign off.